All right, team, let's get started with the posterior forearm musculature today. All right, so you might remember from my last video, if you took a peek at it, that because we're going to be looking at the forearm also means antebrachium, which is also known as the area of the radius and ulna. And we're looking at the posterior side of it today. So the posterior compartment is relatively unique in the actions that it provides. So remember, anytime we're looking at muscles, we're going to be thinking about three really big things for them, obviously, aside from the name: the origin, insertion, and action. So origin is going to be the non-movable portion of the attachment of the muscle. So anytime the muscle is going to be contracting, it's going to be moving towards the origin. Next, the insertion is going to be the movable portion of the attachment of the muscle. So when a muscle contracts, the point of insertion is always going to be moving towards the origin. And finally, the action is just simply what the muscle accomplishes when it contracts and moves the body. And in general, a nice little thing to keep in mind is that the posterior forearm muscles function to extend the wrist and digits. There will be some exceptions to this. However, in general, it's nice to keep in mind that they are the extensor compartment. And remember also, if a tendon or a muscle doesn't cross a joint, then it's never going to have action over it. So that's another thing to keep in mind also. If you're ever looking at a photo or a diagram of something, really just look for your landmarks and think to yourself, well, if it's not crossing that joint, then it's never going to have an action on it. All right, and then another nice generality is that the origin of the majority of the muscles in this compartment is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. So I have that nice green arrow right here pointing at the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. And remember last week when we were talking about the anterior forearm muscles, the origin was mostly the medial epicondyle of the humerus. So today we're really going to be looking at the little guys coming here off of the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. All right, and there are two kind of layers to the posterior compartment of the forearm. So let's start out by looking at the superficial layer. So superficial layer, there are a number of muscles in it, and there are a lot of nice mnemonics to help you remember like the order of the muscles, or you can really just look at them and see where they go to, and then derive the name from there. So let's start out here and let's look at the extensor carpi radialis longus. And remember, whenever there's a longus, there's typically a brevis going along with it also. Not always, but at least here we do recognize that. So we have the extensor carpi radialis longus, and that's going to be coming up from here and traveling down. There's sometimes little muscles crossing over it, so you can't follow it all the way down, but if you were to transect these muscles here, you would see it continuing down here. So the extensor carpi radialis longus is going to be originating from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and then it's going to be inserting down here on metacarpal 2. And so with that, you can tell me that it's going to extend and abduct the wrist. So remember, in anatomical position, the thumb is facing laterally, right, away from the midline of the body. And so because of that, you can say that if something is going to be inserting on kind of the more lateral side here, then we're going to see it's going to extend the wrist and then also abduct, bring it away from the midline of the body. Next, we have the extensor carpi radialis brevis. So remember, he's kind of a little friend of this guy up here. So he's going to be just tucked a little bit beside, or a little bit behind the extensor carpi radialis longus, but the brevis is going to be inserting on metacarpal 3. So you can see it coming down here. You can vaguely see it coming down here to metacarpal 3. And that's going to have actually the same action, to extend and abduct the wrist. So that's kind of nice that you have a longus and a brevis, and basically the only thing that's different between the two is their points of insertion at metacarpal 2 and metacarpal 3. Next, we have the extensor digitorum, and that's going to be kind of this bigger muscle here. I always felt like it was very prominent and very striking to see in person. And the extensor digitorum is going to be inserting on the middle and distal phalanges of digits 2 through 5. So it's not going to be acting on the thumb, but it's going to be acting on everything else. And because it's going all the way down to the middle and distal phalanges, then you know it's going to have action all the way down to the very tips of those digits, or of those phalanges there. So it's going to have action to extend the wrist, the metacarpal phalangeal joint, and then both of the interphalangeal joints, both the proximal and the distal down here, kind of hidden. So extensor digitorum, and it has these really nice long tendons that are coming down and running down. So a lot of the actual muscle is then continued on as the tendinous portion. Next, we have the extensor digiti minimi, and digiti minimi is actually going to be referring to your little finger, or your pinky, as some people call it. So it's going to be inserting then on the proximal phalanx of digit 5. So the proximal phalanx, it's not going to be going all the way, but if you know it's inserting on the proximal phalanx, then you can tell me that it's going to extend the wrist, the metacarpal phalangeal joint, and the proximal interphalangeal joint of digit 5, all right? But no action then on the distal interphalangeal joint of digit 5. And then finally, here in this layer, we have the extensor carpi ulnaris. So extensor carpi ulnaris is going to be kind of over here, extensor carpi ulnaris, right there. So it's going to be a kind of a larger muscle that's going to act to extend and adduct the wrist, because it's going to be inserting on metacarpal 5. So if it's inserting kind of on the more medial side, it's going to then act to pull that wrist in towards the body if you're in anatomical position. So extend and adduct the wrist. And just another point I wanted to reiterate is that in the superficial layer, all of these muscles are going to be originating from that lateral epicondyle of the humerus. So that's nice to keep in mind for the superficial layer here. Let's dive on down to the deep layer. And the deep layer, there are some deviations from our little generality of originating from the lateral epicondyle. So I did denote those here with a little asterisk, and we'll see a couple more as we move on. So we'll start out here with the supinator. And the supinator is going to be performing that action of supination on the forearm. And it's going to be inserting on the anterior radius. So if you think about if something is kind of starting at the back of the arm, or of the forearm here, and inserting to the anterior portion, it's going to provide supination. And I threw in this little graphic again because I think it's simple and easy to understand. So supination is almost just like turning your hand up. So your palm is facing upward, and just imagine that you could hold a little bowl of soup there in your hand. That's how my TAs explained it to me, and I thought that was helpful to understand. And then remember, the opposite of that is pronation, where you would flip your hand down, and your bowl of soup goes flying out of your hand. So remember, supination is going to be occurring here from the supinator. Next, we have the abductor or abductor pollicis longus. So the abductor pollicis longus is going to be inserting on metacarpal 1. So right here, just at that metacarpal of the thumb, and it's going to be abducting digit 1, so pulling digit 1 away from the midline of the body here. And it's going to be one of the exceptions where it originates from the middle ulna. So it's not even crossing the elbow joint here or anything. It's literally just going to be starting here in the middle of the ulna. So abductor pollicis longus right there. And again, a lot of these muscles, as we're coming down in the forearm, or like moving more towards the carpus in the hand, they all have their tendinous portions that are running down kind of across the carpus for the most part. Next, we have the extensor pollicis brevis. So extensor pollicis brevis, we're going to see the extensor pollicis longus after this, but the extensor pollicis brevis is going to be inserting on the proximal phalanx of digit 1. So pollicis referring to the thumb, extensor pollicis brevis, follow him down here. And so he's actually going to be inserting here on the proximal phalanx, not going all the way to the distal, but just to the proximal. So then you can see it's going to be spanning the space of the carpus, or the wrist joint, and the metacarpal phalangeal joint right there of digit 1. So extension in both of those. And that's also going to be originating from the middle radius. So he's kind of one of our exceptions here, that he's not starting all the way up at the top at the lateral epicondyle. All right, there's that supination and pronation again. And then we'll finish it out here with the extensor pollicis longus. So remember, we just looked at the extensor pollicis brevis. And remember, the pollicis brevis actually ended here at the proximal phalanx. Now, the extensor pollicis longus is actually going to be, again, as the name would insinuate, it's going to be longer. So it's actually going to be going all the way down to the distal phalanx of digit 1. So it's going to have action to extend the wrist, the metacarpal phalangeal joint, and the interphalangeal joint of digit 1 of the thumb. And that's going to be originating from the ulna, again, not the lateral epicondyle. All right, and then finally, our last muscle to look at here is the extensor indices. So extensor indices is kind of one of those individual muscles in the respect that it's only going to be going down to like your pointer finger. So it's going to be inserting on the tendon of the extensor digitorum. So remember, the extensor digitorum went all the way down to the very distal phalanx of digits 2 through 5, but in this case, just of digit 2. So you're going to see extension of the wrist, the metacarpal phalangeal joint, and then both the proximal and distal interphalangeal joints of digit 2, the pointer finger. And that's going to be originating from the ulna also. You can see nicely where these muscles are coming off of the ulna, but it's just important to remember that, again, it's not coming off of the lateral epicondyle. And let's see, you can kind of see here, because they carved away some of the other muscles that were layered on top, like that's the full-on view, and then you kind of see just some of the tendons as you come down here. So always look at the tendons and kind of see where they're inserting, and that'll tell you a lot about the muscle and a lot about the action, and normally you can get the name literally just from looking at it in a photo. And that should be about it here. I did just take this this image from class that you guys had, and I kind of labeled it just based on what you would normally be seeing. And I did throw in a couple of extra ones here, like the flexor carpi ulnaris, in the respect that it always kind of looks like it wants to be in the posterior compartment of the forearm, but in reality, it is still part of that anterior compartment of the forearm. So just don't let that trip you up kind of when you get into your naming schemes based on seeing everything. So there's that. And that's about it. So thank you for watching, and please contact Professor Craig about my virtual office hours if you're interested. I'd be happy to review anything you guys want to go over. I'm very flexible on hours. So just keep it in mind, and I hope you guys are enjoying your time studying anatomy. Thank you.